Welcome to my channel, Crimson Enquiry.
In the heart of fog-covered London, a hidden secret begins to stir. A terrified bookbinder arrives at 221B, bringing a mystery no one else dared to touch. A stolen book, and inside it, a parchment worth more than gold and more dangerous than death. Holmes finds a burned seal and a vanished assistant, proof that someone wanted the truth erased. Shadowy figures move through the fog, hunting anyone who knows the secret. A nobleman trembles under Holmes' questions, for the past of his family is built on a lie. Before he can speak, Daniel Pike is taken, stolen from his hospital bed by a false brother. In the tunnels beneath London, Holmes confronts the man sent to silence the truth forever. At Whitehall, the mastermind is revealed, a powerful official guarding a centuries-old conspiracy. But as Holmes walks into the mist, he knows the shadows of this secret are far from finished.
It was upon a drizzling November evening in the year 1891 that Sherlock Holmes, my ever-fascinating companion, received one of the strangest commissions to cross the threshold of 221B Baker Street. The fire burned low in our grate, casting restless shadows upon the walls, while Holmes, with his customary disregard for comfort, sat cross-legged upon the carpet, surrounded by a litter of newspapers, chemical bottles and torn pages of Le Figaro. He was deep in one of his characteristic studies, an experiment upon the detection of printers' ink through volatile reagents, when Mrs. Hudson announced that a gentleman of anxious bearing sought immediate audience with him. "Show him in," Holmes said curtly, without lifting his gaze from the smoking crucible before him. A faint smile played about his lips. "From the tremor of her voice, Watson, I infer that our visitor's nerves are strained to the very limit. Observe, before he even enters, the matter is likely to concern money, fear, and reputation. I give the odds of 7 to 1 that the man's distress stems from blackmail rather than violence." "Really, Holmes," I protested, setting aside my book, "you cannot possibly divine so much from Mrs. Hudson's tone." "On the contrary," he replied, rising as the door opened. "The timbre of a servant's anxiety is the surest barometer of her master's plight." The visitor who entered was a small, neat man of middle age, his coat still damp with mist, and his gloved hands trembling as he removed his hat. His eyes, grey and intelligent, moved nervously about the room as though searching for reassurance in every shadow. He bowed low. "Mr. Holmes?" "Dr. Watson, my name is Edwin Harcourt, bookbinder of Harcourt & Sons, Charing Cross Road. I come to you, sir, in a matter of utmost urgency. Scotland Yard could not assist me. Indeed, they dismissed it as trifling, but I assure you it is nothing of the sort." "Pray be seated, Mr. Harcourt," said Holmes, indicating the chair opposite his own. "Your hands betray the strain you suffer. Before you speak, allow me a few preliminary remarks. You have recently endured a theft of small objects, yet of personal or professional consequence. The matter involves written or printed material, perhaps of private circulation. Am I correct?" The poor man gaped in astonishment. "Why, yes. Yes, Mr. Holmes, but how in heaven's name—" Holmes waved the question aside. "You wear a smear of red Moroccan dust upon your right sleeve. Bookbinding leather, of course. But the deeper groove upon your thumb indicates constant use of a paring knife, not new work. You are a craftsman, then, but not one lately engaged in manual tasks, more likely a proprietor. The ink stain upon your cuff, however, is recent and hasty, as from the sealing of a document. You have come directly from your workshop, yet with no parcel in hand. Clearly you have lost something portable, something that once lay in your care." Harcourt leaned forward, his voice trembling. "It is not only lost, Mr. Holmes, it is vanished. A single volume, bound for a private client, disappeared from my workshop 2 nights ago. But not merely any book. It contained within its covers a document worth a fortune and the secret of a family name." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "A hidden document, concealed within the bindings. The very essence of intrigue. Pray continue." Harcourt took a folded paper from his breast pocket and laid it upon the table. The volume was a 17th-century collection of sermons, to be rebound for Lord Wexford. He brought it himself, instructing me to preserve a certain sheet of parchment found loose within its pages. I sealed the book after hours on Monday night. When I returned the next morning, the lock of my cabinet was intact, but the book was gone. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. A theft without forced entry. Curious indeed. Yes, Harcourt said miserably. And yet there is more. The man who assists me, a quiet journeyman named Daniel Pike, has not been seen since that same night. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the faint hiss of rain upon the window. Watson, Holmes said softly, you may recall my maxim that every man's trade leaves its trace upon his fingers. In this case, it seems a bookbinder's craft may have bound more than paper. It may have bound his fate. He turned to our client with sudden decision. Mr. Harcourt, I shall visit your workshop in the morning. Until then, touch nothing, admit no one, and most of all, say nothing to Lord Wexford. If my suspicions are correct, the case is far from trifling. It may prove the most delicate affair we have yet encountered. And as the bookbinder departed into the fog, Holmes returned to the fire, his expression half thoughtful, half exhilarated. There is, Watson, he murmured, a peculiar scent to this affair, of secrets pressed between old pages, and crimes bound not by glue or string, but by human folly. The following morning broke cold and grey, with a low mist that clung to the rooftops and blurred the edges of Baker Street. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I descended, his coffee untouched, his keen grey eyes bright with that peculiar glint which heralded the beginning of a new adventure. Before him lay his violin case unopened, and beside it a neatly folded note addressed in a bold, unfamiliar hand. "Ah, Watson," he said, glancing up as I entered. "I trust you have no pressing engagements today. We shall require both your sturdy constitution and your capacity for observation." "I am entirely at your disposal," I replied, taking my seat. "Our client, Mr. Harcourt, has left some message, I presume." "Not a message," said Holmes, tapping the folded paper, "but a warning, delivered by a messenger at dawn. It appears our bookbinder is not the only one who takes an interest in the vanished volume." He unfolded the note and pushed it toward me. The writing was elegant, yet curiously uneven, as though penned by one who wished to disguise his hand. It contained but a single line: "Let the matter of the Wexford volume rest, or more than paper will burn." I whistled. "A threat, Holmes? This confirms your suspicions. Someone fears discovery." Holmes's lips curved in a faint smile. "Indeed. But observe the ink. See how it pools at the tail of the R. The writer used a quill, not a steel nib, an affectation seldom seen except among antiquarians or collectors. It narrows our field of suspects considerably. Now finish your coffee, Watson. We go to Charing Cross." Within the hour we were in a cab, rattling through the damp London streets toward Harcourt and Sons. The fog was lifting, revealing rows of rain-darkened shop fronts, and the faint odor of leather and glue met us even before we reached the narrow doorway marked by a modest brass plate. Mr. Edwin Harcourt awaited us within, pale and anxious. His workshop was a long, dim room lined with presses, cutting frames, and rolls of leather stacked neatly upon high shelves. The air was heavy with the scent of polish and age. Holmes removed his gloves and at once began to move about the space, examining everything with the alertness of a hound on the scent. "Dr. Watson," he said quietly, "note the disposition of the benches, 3 in a row. The nearest belonging, I presume, to your missing assistant." "Yes," Harcourt replied, wringing his hands. "That was Daniel Pike's station. He was a quiet, steady fellow, employed with me for nearly 4 years. I cannot believe he would betray me." Holmes crouched by the bench. "We shall allow the facts to speak for him. You say the cabinet was locked?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. It stood at the far end of the room. Only I and Pike possess keys. Then let us begin there. The cabinet was a stout piece of oak, its surface scarred by years of use. Holmes examined the lock with his magnifying lens, his long fingers gliding over the metal. "No sign of forcing," he murmured. "Yet note the faint scratch along the keyhole, too fine for a pick. A duplicate key, perhaps, or a substituted one. Curious." He straightened, his eyes sweeping the room once more. Then, with sudden precision, he lifted a small piece of paper from beneath Pike's bench, a torn scrap no larger than a postage stamp. It bore a fragment of handwriting, a few elegant strokes ending in the partial word Ford. "Wexford, most likely," I said. "Precisely. Handwritten, observe, in the same hand as our morning's note. The pressure is identical." He slipped the scrap carefully into his pocketbook. "Our anonymous correspondent has been here, Watson, perhaps even before the disappearance. At that moment, Harcourt gave a sharp exclamation. "Mr. Holmes! Look, on the floor behind the press." Holmes was instantly beside him, stooping to retrieve a tiny object half hidden beneath the wooden frame. It was a button, small of black horn, and bearing upon it the faint crest of a stag's head. Holmes turned it over in his palm. "Not from your own coat, Mr. Harcourt?" The bookbinder shook his head. "No, sir. I never saw such a button before." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we are fortunate indeed. This, Watson, is from the livery of Lord Wexford's household. I have seen it once before, at a reception in Belgrave Square. It appears that our noble client takes a more direct interest in his book than he pretends. You think Lord Wexford himself? Patience, my dear Watson. We merely follow the trail as it unfolds. Still, it is an uncommon thing for a peer of the realm to haunt a tradesman's workshop at night." He rose, dusting his hands. "Mr. Harcourt, you will kindly furnish me with your assistant's address and any particulars you possess concerning him. Watson and I shall make a call there this evening. In the meantime, I suggest you maintain your usual routine. The person who took that book believes himself unobserved. If he suspects our involvement, he may act rashly." As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the door, his eyes fixed upon a faint smear upon the workshop floor, a streak of darkened polish leading toward a narrow side window. He knelt, touched the mark lightly, and raised his finger to the light. "Grease," he murmured, "from a lantern wick. Yet you, Mr. Harcourt, use gaslight exclusively. Who then would bring an oil lamp into this room?" "I cannot imagine," Harcourt stammered. "We have no such lamps here." "Then someone did," said Holmes. "Someone who needed light when none should have been burning." He looked up sharply. "And someone who entered by that window." The frame bore the faintest impression of a thumbprint in dust. Holmes examined it silently, then turned to me with a quick nod. "We have our intruder, Watson. One who leaves no mark upon the door, yet enters with a lamp through the window. There is a subtle mind at work here." We took our leave shortly thereafter, stepping once more into the grey bustle of the street. As the cab carried us away, I studied Holmes's face, searching for some clue to his thoughts, but his expression remained unreadable. At last, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "A missing journeyman, a nobleman's crest, a threat written with an antiquarian's quill, and a theft without entry. Each thread seems fragile in isolation, Watson, but together they form the beginning of a most intriguing tapestry." He leaned back, eyes half closed, as if listening to some inner symphony of reason. "There is something about this affair," he continued, "that smacks of deliberate artifice, of an intellect which delights in concealment for its own sake. I should not be surprised if our missing bookbinder proves less of a thief than a pawn in another man's game." He opened his eyes then, sharp and luminous in the gloom of the cab. "Mark my words, Watson. Before this day is out, the name of Lord Wexford will reappear, and when it does, the true nature of this secret case will begin to unfold." The wheels clattered over the cobbles as London's fog closed in again, thick and secretive, as though it too wished to keep the bookbinder's mystery shrouded a little longer. That afternoon found us at a modest lodging-house in Bloomsbury, where Daniel Pike, the missing journeyman, was said to have resided. The fog had thickened once more, and the lamps glowed dimly through its veil, casting ghostly halos upon the wet pavement. Holmes walked ahead with brisk, purposeful strides, his coat collar turned up, the brim of his hat shadowing his keen eyes. He had spoken little during our journey, save for a brief observation that the pattern of events seemed too artfully constructed to be mere coincidence. The landlady who received us was a thin, nervous woman with reddened hands and a manner that hovered between suspicion and fear. "Yes, sir," she said, wringing her apron as Holmes showed her his card. "Mr. Pike's been with me near 3 years, quiet as a church mouse, never late with his rent. But I've not seen hide nor hair of him since Monday night. Left his supper untouched, he did. I thought maybe he'd taken ill, or worse," Holmes prompted gently. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "there's been talk in the neighborhood. Men loitering near the alley after dark, gentlemen, by their dress. One of them asked for Mr. Pike by name." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Gentlemen, you say? More than one?" "Two, sir. One tall and thin, with a voice like gravel, the other shorter, wearing a velvet collar. They said they had business from Charing Cross." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Describe the tall man." "Couldn't rightly see his face, sir." The fog was thick that night, but he had a cane, tapped it all the while like he couldn't keep still. Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you, madam. You have been most helpful. May we see Mr. Pike's room?" She led us up a narrow staircase to a small chamber at the end of the hall. It was scrupulously tidy. Bed neatly made, tools arranged with care upon a shelf, a small desk by the window overlooking the alley below. Holmes surveyed the room in silence for several minutes, moving lightly about, his gaze missing nothing. At length, he drew aside the thin curtains and peered down into the street. "The window latch has been recently disturbed," he said. "See, Watson, the dust is smudged where the catch was lifted. Someone entered here, likely from the alley. That accords with the landlady's story." He turned to the desk where a few sheets of paper lay scattered. Picking one up, he examined it closely. It appeared to be a page of notes. Careful, slanting handwriting, half mechanical, half reflective. "Ah," Holmes exclaimed softly. "Pike was no ordinary workman. Observe these lines. Measurements, annotations of parchment thickness, even the age of glue. This is the hand of a man who thought deeply about his craft. Yet here, look, he has written a single phrase 3 times. The seal must not be broken. What do you make of that, Watson?" "It sounds like an instruction," I said, puzzled. "Perhaps connected with the book?" "Possibly. But consider the emphasis, thrice repeated as if to steady his own resolve. Pike feared something, perhaps even himself." He folded the page and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with his usual abruptness, he crossed to the small fireplace. There, beneath a thin layer of ash, he uncovered the half-charred remains of a wax seal, stamped with a W crowned by a crest, a stag's head identical to that on the button we had found. "Wexford again," Holmes murmured. "The web tightens." He examined the ashes with his lens, his expression hardening. "Watson, this seal was burned within the last 48 hours. Pike may have tried to destroy evidence, or to conceal something of greater importance. Either way, he was interrupted. The mark upon the latch suggests his visitor was uninvited. At that moment, a faint sound reached us from the alley below, a shuffling of feet, the scrape of metal upon stone." Holmes froze, his head tilted slightly. Then, with a motion of his hand, he extinguished the lamp. The room fell into shadow. We stood motionless by the window. A figure had emerged from the fog, a man in a long coat, his hat pulled low, glancing up toward the very window where we stood. He lingered a moment as if uncertain, then turned sharply and disappeared down the street. Holmes waited until the echo of his footsteps had faded before relighting the lamp. "We are not alone in our curiosity, Watson. That man has returned to search the room. He will not find what he seeks tonight." He looked again at the charred wax. "The seal. Its impression suggests more than mere ornament. It is the device of the Wexford line, but altered. The stag's antlers are entwined with a serpent, an older symbol, one associated with the family's 17th-century crest, later abandoned after a certain scandal. Curious that it should reappear now, in connection with a missing book and a vanished workman." He stood silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then, with sudden decision, he replaced his hat. "Come, Watson. Our next step lies with Lord Wexford himself. We must see what manner of man guards his secrets so jealously." We left the house and hailed a cab for Belgrave Square. The streets were darker now, the fog thickening again, wrapping the city in its damp embrace. Holmes sat deep in thought, the faint rhythmic tapping of his fingers on his knee the only sound. At length he spoke. "Do you recall, Watson, the case of the Bishop's Codex? How a false leaf was inserted among genuine pages to conceal a cipher? I suspect something similar here. The parchment Harcourt mentioned may not be what it appeared. The thief's goal was not the book itself, but what was hidden within it. And Pike?" I asked. "An accomplice or a victim?" "That," Holmes said quietly, "is what we must learn. If he fled, it was not with profit in mind. His notes suggest conscience, not greed. But if he was silenced—" He stopped abruptly as the cab drew up before a grand townhouse. "Ah, here we are. Let us see what truths a nobleman's courtesy may conceal." A liveried butler received us with the measured politeness of one accustomed to unwelcome visitors. Lord Wexford, he informed us, was at home and would see us presently. We were shown into a richly appointed study, its shelves lined with old volumes bound in tooled leather, the air faintly scented with tobacco and polish. Holmes's gaze roved swiftly over the room, the antique desk, the crystal decanter, the tall cabinet of rare bindings. At last the door opened, and Lord Wexford entered. A man of 50, broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair and eyes as cold as cut steel. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his tones smooth yet wary. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes bowed slightly. "We are investigating a matter concerning your volume of sermons, my lord, the one entrusted to Mr. Harcourt. It appears to have vanished." Lord Wexford's expression did not change. "So I have been informed. A regrettable incident. I trust you have made progress?" Holmes studied him for a moment before replying. "Progress, yes, but of a curious kind. You see, my lord, the theft appears to have been committed by someone intimately acquainted with your family crest. Might I ask, why did you instruct that the loose parchment within the book be preserved?" Wexford's eyes flickered, though his voice remained calm. "It was a family document, of sentimental value only." "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "Then I wonder why your servants were seen in Bloomsbury 2 nights past, inquiring after a journeyman bookbinder. It seems a long way to go in pursuit of sentiment." For the first time a shadow crossed the nobleman's face. "I know nothing of that," he said curtly. "You may direct your questions elsewhere." Holmes inclined his head. "As you wish, my lord. But rest assured, the matter of the Wexford volume will not rest. More than paper is at stake." The faintest tremor passed over Wexford's hand as he reached for his cigar. "Then, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "I suggest you tread with care. Some secrets, once opened, refuse to close again." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "That, my lord, is precisely why I intend to open them." Outside, as we stepped once more into the fog, I felt a chill that had little to do with the night air. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated. His eyes were bright, his stride quick. "Watson," he said at last, "our nobleman plays his part well, but he underestimates the evidence. Tomorrow we shall call again, this time not upon his house, but upon his history. There are ghosts in the Wexford line, and I mean to speak with them." The gas lamps flickered behind us as we vanished into the London mist, the city's vast heart beating quietly beneath its shroud, while somewhere within it lay the truth of the bookbinder's secret, waiting to be found. The cab wheels splashed through puddles as we left Belgrave Square, the thick mist coiling once more around the lamps like a living thing. Holmes sat rigid in his seat, his chin resting lightly on his hand, his gaze distant but intent. I knew that look well. It was the stillness before the leap, the mental poise from which his deductions would spring. When at last he spoke, it was in that low, deliberate tone which meant his mind was fully engaged. "Watson, you observed Lord Wexford's right hand?" I did. It trembled slightly when he spoke of the parchment. "Precisely, and yet his voice was steady, his manner controlled. It was the tremor of a man not fearful of discovery, but of recollection. Whatever lies within that missing book is bound to an old wound. That is why he guards it so fiercely, and why others would risk much to obtain it." I could not help but frown. "You believe the parchment relates to some ancient scandal, then?" Holmes nodded slowly. "A scandal, yes, but not of reputation alone. You recall the serpent entwined about the stag upon the old Wexford crest? That symbol was expunged from the heraldic record in 1723, following a trial for treason involving a certain Sir Alaric Wexford. The charge was espionage against the crown during the Jacobite uprisings. The serpent denoted betrayal. The family, desperate to preserve its title, swore the matter into silence. I suspect that parchment contained the proof, the confession or cipher left behind by that disgraced ancestor. But why should anyone seek it now, after nearly 2 centuries? Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because, my dear Watson, secrets have a way of maturing like wine. What was once a shame may, in time, become a weapon. Suppose that document contained evidence capable of undermining the present Lord Wexford's claim to his estate, or of exposing a political connection best left buried. There are men in London who would pay dearly for such leverage." The cab drew up outside Baker Street. Inside, the fire still burned low from the morning, and the air was thick with the comforting scent of tobacco. Holmes flung himself into his chair and reached for his violin, letting the bow drift lightly across the strings. The melody that followed was slow and restless, like the movement of thought through shadow. I poured us each a glass of brandy and waited. Presently he set the instrument aside. "Watson, there are 2 avenues before us. The first is to trace the parchment's history through official archives. The second, and more urgent, is to locate Daniel Pike. If he lives, he may hold the key to all, and if he does not—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. I rose at once. "Where shall we begin?" "With the first," Holmes said, "for paper often tells its tale before men do." The following morning we made our way to Somerset House, where the heraldic and genealogical records of England were kept. Holmes, with his customary precision, presented a note from the Home Office, a favour he had cultivated through past services, and we were soon bent over ancient volumes, the air heavy with the dust of centuries. For hours he turned page after page, his long fingers tracing faded ink and brittle parchment. At last he paused, tapping the margin with one finger. "Here, Watson. The crest of the Wexford line prior to 1723, the stag and serpent entwined. The motto beneath, Fidem Serva, keep the faith. Yet note the amendment written in a later hand, abolished upon order of the Crown, May 1723. Beneath it a cryptic annotation, record sealed, document returned to private custody." "Returned to the family," I said softly. "Exactly. That document must have survived through the generations, hidden among family papers, until it came into Lord Wexford's possession. He chose to conceal it within the binding of a book, a clever precaution, yet not clever enough. Someone learned of it." Holmes closed the volume, dust rising in a soft cloud. "We have established the parchment's nature, but not its present whereabouts. Pike's disappearance remains our most promising lead. There is one man who might assist us, Inspector Lestrade. Scotland Yard has ears where we have only shadows." Within the hour we found ourselves in Lestrade's cluttered office. The inspector greeted us with his usual mixture of irritation and respect. "Holmes, you're the very devil for stirring up the yard. I've heard whispers already about your noble client." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then perhaps those whispers carry useful news. Has a man named Daniel Pike come to your attention?" Lestrade rifled through a stack of papers. "Pike, Daniel. Yes, here we are. Found unconscious 2 nights ago in the Docks district, Whitechapel Way. No identification at first, but later traced to his lodgings in Bloomsbury. Still at St. Bartholomew's Hospital under observation. Nasty blow to the head, though the doctors expect he'll live." "Excellent," Holmes murmured, rising at once. "Watson, the game advances." We reached the hospital as the afternoon waned. The ward was quiet save for the muffled sounds of patients and the echoing footsteps of nurses. Pike lay in a narrow bed by the window, his face pale beneath a bandage, his breathing shallow but even. A young surgeon greeted us, explaining that the man had been struck from behind and robbed of all possessions, save a single scrap of parchment found clutched in his hand. Holmes' eyes lit with a flash of triumph. "May we see it?" The surgeon produced a small envelope. Inside lay a torn fragment of yellowed parchment, the edges frayed and scorched. Upon it, in faded ink, were the words, "Faith kept, though kings fall." Holmes examined it beneath his lens. The same hand, the same century. The remainder of the document must have been taken from him. But this portion alone tells us much. "Faith kept, though kings fall," a phrase that smacks of Jacobite loyalty. Pike must have discovered the document's meaning and sought to protect it. He was attacked before he could reach safety. As we turned to leave, Pike stirred, his lips moving faintly. Holmes bent close, his ear almost touching the man's mouth. A single word escaped, hoarse, broken, yet unmistakable. "Binders, press." Then he sank once more into silence. Outside the ward, Holmes's expression was grim. "The press, Watson. The binding press at Harcourt's shop. He hid something there before he fled. That is why our mysterious visitor returned to the workshop last night. They sought what Pike concealed. We hurried back through the darkening streets to Charing Cross. The shop was closed, but Harcourt, who lived above, admitted us without question." Holmes moved at once to the heavy press near Pike's old bench, examining it with swift, eager hands. Then, with a quick motion, he drew forth his penknife and pried at a narrow seam along the wooden frame. A small panel loosened, and from within he drew a folded sheet of parchment. "By heaven," I whispered, "he hid it here all along." Holmes spread the document upon the bench. It was covered in cramped 17th century script, the ink faded but legible. Across the bottom, sealed with wax bearing the serpent and stag crest, ran the name Alaric Wexford. Holmes's eyes shone with fierce satisfaction. "We hold the confession itself, Watson, the very heart of the Wexford secret." Before I could reply, the sound of a latch clicking broke the silence. The shop door creaked open, and a shadow crossed the threshold. Holmes raised his head sharply, his hand still upon the parchment. "Ah," he said softly. "Our unseen correspondent chooses an inconvenient hour to collect his prize." The figure stepped forward into the dim light, and I caught the glint of a revolver's barrel. "Mr. Holmes," came a cold, familiar voice, "I must ask you to hand over that document. Some legacies, you see, are better left unread." It was Lord Wexford himself. For an instant, the air in the workshop seemed to freeze. Lord Wexford stood motionless in the doorway, the dim light catching the polished metal of the revolver he held. The fire from Harcourt's small stove cast a dull glow across his face, revealing not malice, but the taut desperation of a man driven to the edge. Holmes did not move, his eyes fixed on the weapon with the calm precision of a chess player, studying his opponent's final move. "You've come a long way, my lord," Holmes said evenly. "A curious risk for a man of your position, to break into a tradesman's shop after midnight." Wexford's hand trembled slightly, but his voice held firm. "I did not come to rob, Mr. Holmes. I came to preserve. That parchment belongs to my family, and I will not allow it to be made public." "Preserve," Holmes repeated softly. "An interesting word. Tell me, is it the truth you wish to preserve, or the illusion built upon its burial?" The Lord's jaw tightened. "You understand nothing. That paper, if revealed, would destroy a name that has stood unblemished for 2 centuries. My forebears suffered enough disgrace. I would not see their shame paraded before Parliament and the press." Holmes's eyes glinted. "And yet you forget, my lord, that your own actions, bribery, intimidation, and tonight's attempted theft would do far worse should they become known. The irony, I fear, is exquisite." Wexford took a slow step forward, the revolver unwavering. "You leave me no choice. Hand it over." Holmes raised a hand slightly, palm outward. "One moment more. Before you seal your own ruin, allow me to clarify what you seek to suppress." The confession of Alaric Wexford, dated April 1723, detailing his dealings with the Jacobite cause. Yes, treason, but treason in service of a fallen king, not for gold or betrayal. He sought pardon, my lord, not infamy. His final words, "Faith kept, though kings fall, speak not of deceit, but of loyalty misjudged by time." A flicker of confusion crossed the nobleman's face. How could you know that?" "Because," Holmes replied, pointing to the parchment, "I have read it. The original intent of your ancestors' confession was redemption, not disgrace. It was the Crown's overzealous hand that twisted his name into treachery. The suppression of this record was an act of political convenience, not justice. Revealing it now would not destroy your family. It would restore it." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The revolver wavered just slightly. Then Wexford exhaled a shuddering breath and lowered his hand. "Good God," he whispered. "All my life I've borne the weight of a lie." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then lift it, my lord. Let the truth stand. I have no desire for your ruin, only for the clarity that justice demands." The nobleman's fingers slackened, and the revolver clattered harmlessly to the floor. I stepped forward at once and retrieved it. Wexford sank onto a nearby stool, his face pale but strangely peaceful, as though a burden had been eased at last. Harcourt, who had watched the exchange in silence, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but what's to be done with that paper now?" "It don't seem the sort of thing a man can just tuck away again." Holmes folded the parchment with care. "Quite right, Mr. Harcourt. It will be sealed under the custody of the Crown Archives, with a full account of its authenticity. The truth at last shall not need to hide in the spine of a book." He turned to Wexford. "I trust you will assist me in this matter, my lord. Transparency, as you will discover, is often the surest path to peace." Wexford nodded faintly. Yes, of course. Whatever you advise." It was near dawn when we left the workshop. The first light of morning struggled through the fog, bathing the narrow street in a dull silver glow. Holmes walked in silence beside me, the collar of his coat turned up against the chill. "You handled him gently," I remarked. "Truth, when delivered without cruelty, can mend as well as cut," he replied. "Had I humiliated him, we would have gained only another enemy. Instead, we may have preserved a man's honor, and perhaps in a small way the integrity of history itself." I smiled faintly. "Then it is over?" He gave a soft, sardonic laugh. "For this night, yes. But there is still one question, Watson. The hand that struck Daniel Pike. Wexford may have sought the document, but the blow dealt to Pike bears the mark of another. I frowned. You think there was a second party involved? I do. The attack was clumsy, violent, and desperate, hardly the style of a man like Wexford, whose methods lean toward discretion. So the hand behind that assault is yet unseen. Before I could reply, the clatter of approaching footsteps echoed from behind us. We turned, and from the mist emerged Lestrade, hat in hand and face drawn with urgency. Holmes, thank heaven I found you. There's been another development. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Concerning? The hospital. Pike, he's gone. Gone? I exclaimed. Lestrade nodded grimly. Vanished an hour before dawn. Nurse says a man claiming to be his brother presented credentials and took him away. No such brother exists. Holmes's expression darkened. So the final player makes his entrance. Whoever spirited Pike away fears what he might reveal. Come, Watson, there's no time to lose. We hurried through the streets toward the nearest cab. The fog was lifting now, the outlines of buildings growing sharper against the brightening sky. Holmes leapt inside and rapped sharply on the roof. To St. Bartholomew's, fast as you can. As the carriage jolted forward, I could see the familiar light in his eyes, the keen, consuming fire of pursuit. The case of the bookbinder's secret, he murmured, almost to himself, is not quite closed. The parchment was but the shell. The heart of the matter lies still beneath it. Someone else knew, Watson. Someone who has moved through these shadows unseen. He leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. And now, my dear friend, we must find the invisible hand that bound the past to the present, before it binds us all. The cab wheels thundered through the awakening city, and I knew with absolute certainty that what had begun with a single torn page was far from its final chapter. The cab rattled through the waking streets, the fog thinning just enough for the gas lights to gleam like fading stars along the cobblestones. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his long fingers pressed together before his face, the keen edge of his mind plainly at work. I dared not interrupt him. The horse's hooves echoed in a steady rhythm, sharp, deliberate, almost like the ticking of a clock, counting down to some unseen deadline. When we arrived at St. Bartholomew's, Lestrade hurried us through the side entrance, his boots squeaking against the linoleum floors still damp from the morning's cleaning. This way, he muttered, leading us into the ward. The nurse who last saw Pike's supposed brother is waiting. The woman was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a nervous manner. She clutched her apron tightly as she spoke. He came just after 3, sir. Said his name was Samuel Pike, the patient's brother. He had a letter with the hospital seal, perfectly signed and dated. I had no reason to doubt him. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Describe him, if you please. Tall, thin, dark hair. Wore a brown coat and carried a walking stick. He spoke softly but with an accent. Irish, I'd wager. Left-handed or right-handed? Holmes asked abruptly. She blinked. Left, I think. He signed the form that way. Holmes gave a small nod as though confirming something privately. And the patient, how was he removed? In a wheelchair. He looked dazed, sir, still recovering from his injury. The man said the doctors at another ward would be taking over care. Lestrade scowled. We've searched the premises top to bottom, Holmes. No sign of either of them. There's no carriage log. No one at the gate saw them leave. Holmes turned toward the window. Outside, the morning fog was retreating from the sun, revealing the dull gleam of wet cobbles. Then they didn't leave by carriage, he murmured. A man in haste, carrying an invalid, could scarcely traverse the city unseen. No, Inspector, our quarry went underground. Underground, I repeated. He turned to me. Precisely, Watson. The hospital's rear passage connects to the old service tunnels, the remnants of a Victorian sewer line, long since sealed off from the main system. Few remember its existence, but one who worked among bindings and repairs might have discovered it by chance. You think this impostor was connected to Harcourt's workshop? I think, Holmes said, his eyes gleaming, that the bookbinder's art is not confined to books. Someone is binding the truth together, stitching lies into order as deftly as a craftsman sews leather to parchment. Come, there is more to be learned from the space Pike occupied than from the corridor he vanished through. We followed him to the patient's cot. Holmes examined it with surgical precision, his gaze flitting from the crumpled sheets to the faint indentation left by the wheels of the chair. He crouched low, tracing a dark smudge on the floor with the tip of his gloved finger. Soot, he murmured. Coal soot mixed with oil and horsehair. Lestrade frowned. That's hardly unusual in London. Indeed, Holmes agreed, but peculiar upon a hospital floor, especially at this hour. This residue matches the dust I found on the soles of Harcourt's apprentice yesterday. Pike's abductor has been in that workshop, or one like it. He rose swiftly, eyes flashing. Inspector, dispatch a man to search the alleys behind Harcourt's premises. There's a drain cover near the mews, disused but not forgotten. For if I am right, it connects to these tunnels. Watson, you will accompany me. Within the hour we stood again in the narrow lane behind the workshop, the morning light struggling to pierce the smog. Lestrade's men had already uncovered the old drain, a heavy iron grate half concealed by a mound of refuse. Holmes knelt and brushed away the debris. Note the scrape marks along the rim, he said. Recently moved and by no small effort. He produced a lantern from his coat, lit it and handed me a spare. Careful footing, Watson. These old passages can be treacherous. The air grew colder as we descended into the dark. The tunnel was narrow, its brickwork slick with damp. Our footsteps echoed faintly, mingled with the distant drip of water. Holmes led the way, his lantern beam cutting through the gloom. We followed a winding path until the faintest glimmer of light flickered ahead. Holmes motioned for silence. From beyond a low arch came the murmur of voices. 2 men, one weak and slurred, the other harsh and commanding. Told you I don't have it. Pike's voice quavered. A rough laugh followed. You had it long enough to hide it. You think I won't make you talk? Holmes's expression hardened. Stay here, he whispered. Before I could protest, he crept forward, every movement silent as shadow. I held my breath, clutching the lantern low. The next moment there came a sharp crash, the scuffle of feet and a shout of pain. I sprang forward to find Holmes locked in struggle with a tall man, the same dark-haired figure the nurse had described. The stranger struck wildly, sending Holmes reeling against the wall. But before he could flee, Lestrade burst through the archway behind me, revolver drawn. Hold it there! He barked. The man froze, chest heaving. Pike lay slumped nearby, pale and trembling. Holmes straightened, dusting off his coat, his face set in fierce concentration. Your name, sir? He demanded. The intruder sneered. Patrick Donlin. You've no right to interfere. Holmes's tone turned icy. On the contrary, you've abducted a witness, impersonated a relative and concealed evidence tied to a matter of national history. I think that grants me some authority. Donlin's eyes darted wildly, as if searching for escape. You don't understand, he hissed. I was sent to keep it quiet. The parchment. Wexford wasn't the only one who wanted it buried. Ah, Holmes said softly. So we arrive at last to the hidden hand. Tell me, Mr. Donlin, who employs a failed forger and ex-soldier for so delicate a task? Donlin's lips pressed tight. I've said too much. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze like steel. Then let me enlighten you. The very ministry that condemned Wexford's ancestor for treason now fears the restoration of that truth. Someone within the archives ordered Pike silenced, and you carried it out. I suspect your employer keeps offices near Whitehall. The man's eyes flickered. Confirmation enough for Holmes. Lestrade's men closed in and secured him with cuffs. Holmes turned to Pike, checking his pulse. He'll live, he said quietly, though the weight of what he's seen will take longer to fade. As we ascended once more into the morning light, Holmes remained silent until we reached the street. Then, with a faint smile, he said, We are drawing near, Watson. One piece remains before the picture is whole. The forger, the nobleman, the clerk, all threads of a single tapestry. And the final stitch lies, I believe, in the hands of the crown itself. He paused, gazing toward the distant silhouette of Westminster against the pale sun. When corruption hides behind the mask of honor, he murmured, it is not the criminal we must expose, but the conscience of the empire itself. And with that he strode off toward Baker Street, his mind already 3 moves ahead while I followed, half in awe, half in dread, knowing that the game was far from over. Holmes was unusually silent upon our return to Baker Street. The early afternoon light slanted through the curtains, drawing long dusty beams across the sitting room. He paced before the hearth, the fingers of one hand steepled beneath his chin while the other toyed idly with his pipe, unlit for once. His brow was furrowed, his thoughts clearly racing through connections invisible to all but himself. I sat opposite, watching him with growing impatience. You believe Donlan's confession to be genuine? I asked at last. Holmes looked up sharply. Genuine in part, Watson, but not complete. Donlan is no more than a tool, a blade wielded by another. His nervousness betrays not guilt of invention, but fear of retribution. He's terrified of the man who employed him. Someone in the government, you said? Indeed, and not merely a clerk or archivist. We are dealing with a man of influence, one capable of authorizing false credentials, suppressing official records, and employing violence when discretion fails. Such authority narrows the field considerably. Lestrade, who had remained after escorting Donlan to Scotland Yard, leaned forward. You think this reaches into Whitehall, then? Holmes gave a thin smile. I do not think, Inspector, I am certain, but we must tread carefully. If the hand behind this truly sits in the corridors of power, a misstep could see the entire affair buried deeper than before, and us along with it. Lestrade grunted. Well, my superiors won't like that one bit. Still, I'll see what can be pried from the arrest records. Donlan will talk once the fear wears off. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Fear, my dear Lestrade, can be more durable than conscience. Yet every man, however guarded, reveals something of his master if pressed from the right direction. I shall pay Donlan a visit this evening alone. The inspector rose reluctantly. Just don't get yourself locked up in the process. The Yard's patience for your methods is wearing thin. Holmes inclined his head with faint amusement. Then we shall endeavor to be charming. When Lestrade had gone, Holmes resumed his pacing. I knew the look in his eyes too well. It was the look of a man building a bridge in his mind piece by piece, across a river of chaos. You suspect someone in the Home Office? I ventured. Holmes paused, tapping the side of his nose. Consider the facts, Watson. A document of national import hidden for generations. Its revelation would restore honor to one noble house while exposing deceit in another. Add to that the existence of forgeries within official seals. Someone has gone to great lengths to maintain a particular narrative of history. The motive, therefore, is not money but preservation of power. Then who stands to lose if the Wexford confession becomes public? Holmes's expression darkened. An old family, perhaps one whose fortune was built upon the fall of Wexford's ancestor. Their descendants may now sit in Parliament, in the very offices that determine what truths are allowed to surface. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small envelope, its seal broken but still bearing the faint crest of the Metropolitan Police. This was left by one of Inspector Lestrade's men, sir, she said. Holmes took it eagerly, scanning the single-folded sheet within. His eyes flicked rapidly across the lines, and then he handed it to me. It was a brief report. Donlan, after several hours in custody, had been found unconscious in his cell. The guard swore no one had entered, but the man's pulse was weak, his breathing shallow as though he had been poisoned. Holmes set his pipe aside. So they move faster than I anticipated. Donlan was a loose end, and loose ends, Watson, are intolerable to men who operate in shadows. You think he was silenced? Undoubtedly. The question is, by whom and how? Scotland Yard is not so porous as to allow such an act unaided. Holmes seized his coat. We go at once. There may yet be a trace of the hand that delivered the blow. Within the hour we stood in the dim corridor of the Yard's holding cells. Lestrade met us, his face drawn and weary. You've heard, then? He's alive, but barely. Doctor says some kind of soporific, powerful enough to stop his heart had the dose been greater. Holmes knelt beside the cot where Donlan lay. The man's face was pallid, beads of sweat glistening upon his brow. Holmes examined his hands, his cuffs, the faint bruise along his neck. No injection marks. The poison was delivered orally, likely through water or tobacco. Lestrade frowned. He had neither since his arrest. Precisely, said Holmes, which means the poison was administered before his capture. He turned suddenly toward me. Watson, do you recall the faint smell upon Donlan's coat in the tunnel? Turpentine, I said, mixed with something sharp. Ether, perhaps. Holmes snapped his fingers. Exactly. A varnish used by book restorers to treat aged leather. The same scent hung in Harcourt's workshop. Donlan was not merely an enforcer, he was working under someone intimately connected to that trade. Someone who could mask poison in a solvent or paste, knowing it would be absorbed through the skin. Lestrade looked baffled. And who might that be? Holmes straightened. We shall see soon enough. But I suspect the circle around Harcourt's shop is not yet closed. The key may lie in his clientele, specifically those whose libraries required his special restorations. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes pored over Harcourt's ledger, which Lestrade had retrieved earlier. The list of clients spanned half of London's gentry, collectors, scholars, even government officials. One name, however, Holmes underlined twice: Sir Reginald Ashcroft, Under-Secretary of Historical Records. I leaned over his shoulder. "The Home Office," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "The very department responsible for maintaining the Crown Archives. Ashcroft would have both the access and the motive to suppress the Wexford confession. If the truth came to light, the fraudulent narrative upheld by his forebears would collapse. Donlan was his instrument, Harcourt his craftsman." He closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "Tomorrow, Watson, we pay Sir Reginald a visit. But not as ourselves. A man like Ashcroft hides his dealings behind propriety. He will not speak freely to Sherlock Holmes. I knew that gleam in his eye. A disguise. Two, perhaps," he said with a grin. "A tradesman and his assistant, come to discuss a private commission in book restoration. If fortune favours us, we shall learn whether the Under-Secretary keeps his secrets bound in paper or in blood." I could not help but feel a chill run down my spine as he spoke. The fog outside pressed against the window like a living thing, and the faint tolling of St. Paul's bells drifted through the night air. Somewhere beyond the river, the machinery of deceit continued its silent motion, and Holmes, ever relentless, was preparing to thrust a wrench into its gears. He settled into his chair at last, lighting his pipe with the calm of a man staring into the heart of chaos. "The bookbinder's secret," he murmured, exhaling a thin ribbon of smoke, "has grown beyond parchment and ink. We are dealing now with history itself, Watson, history rewritten by those who fear the truth." And as the fire crackled low, I realized that the shadows cast by that truth might reach further than either of us could yet imagine. The next morning dawned grey and wet, a steady drizzle sweeping over Baker Street and misting the windows of our sitting room. Holmes had already transformed the place into a scene of quiet industry. Brushes, dyes, and fragments of old leather lay strewn across the table, alongside a battered portfolio of papers and 2 worn coats. I found him at the mirror, darkening, his hair with a touch of lampblack, and affixing a small scar beneath his left eye. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed. "What character are you this time?" He regarded his reflection critically. "Ebenezer Griggs, tradesman and specialist in archival restoration. You, my dear Watson, are his loyal assistant, silent, diligent, and perhaps a trifle dull. I'll have to rely on nature for that part," I said dryly. A brief smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Quite. Now, the ledger's address lists Sir Reginald Ashcroft's office at Whitehall, but it is his private residence in Belgrave Square that interests us. The Under-Secretary conducts his most delicate work away from prying eyes. If we approach as mere artisans, we may find our way into the lion's den without the lion suspecting the trap." Within the hour, our hansom cab rolled through the rain-slicked streets toward Belgrave Square. The great townhouses loomed pale and dignified against the gloom, their brass fittings gleaming faintly through the drizzle. Holmes descended with the easy air of a tradesman long accustomed to deference. He carried a wrapped portfolio beneath, his arm, while I followed a step behind, feeling rather out of place in my borrowed coat and cap. A liveried servant met us at the door. "Sir Reginald receives by appointment only," he said curtly. Holmes gave a deferential bow. "Indeed, indeed. Mr. Harcourt himself commended us to his honour's attention. We bring samples for the restoration. To have several volumes in the Ashcroft collection, manuscripts of the 15th century, I believe." The man's expression softened at the mention of Harcourt. "Ah, yes. Sir Reginald did mention a pending commission. Wait here." Moments later, we were ushered into a grand study lined with towering shelves of books. The smell of leather and polish filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of tobacco. Sir Reginald Ashcroft sat behind a mahogany desk, a tall, spare man with silvered hair and a face of studied serenity. His pale eyes, however, were sharp as glass. "Mr. Griggs, is it?" he said, rising courteously. "I trust you found the journey tolerable." "Most agreeable, sir," Holmes replied, bowing. "Your collection is spoken of with great admiration among craftsmen of my trade. Few libraries in London are so well preserved. Ashcroft allowed a faint smile. My family has always valued history, Mr. Griggs. One must care for the past lest it decay. Indeed, Holmes murmured. Decay has a habit of revealing what Polish once concealed. For the briefest instant, Ashcroft's gaze flickered, but he recovered at once. You bring samples, I believe. Holmes laid the portfolio upon the desk, unwrapping several pieces of embossed leather and gilt tooling. The finest calf and Morocco, sir. We take pride in matching not only the texture, but the spirit of the original binding. As Ashcroft examined the samples, Holmes' eyes roamed the shelves with apparent casualness. I followed his gaze. The library was immaculate, every spine aligned, every surface gleaming. Yet one volume on the upper shelf stood out. A heavy folio, its edges unevenly cut and its label recently replaced. Holmes's hand brushed his chin, a gesture I knew well. Exquisite work, Ashcroft was saying. And you are certain Harcourt recommended you personally? Most assuredly, sir, Holmes said smoothly. He spoke of a commission recently completed for a noble client, the restoration of a volume containing certain genealogical papers. A family by the name of Wexford, I think he said. The faintest shadow crossed Ashcroft's face. Wexford, he repeated. I am not acquainted with them. Ah, my mistake, Holmes said lightly. Names tend to blur in a busy workshop. Still, remarkable craftsmanship in that particular job. The binding concealed a compartment so finely fitted one might never have suspected its presence. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the air. Then Ashcroft's tone cooled. Your trade seems to have bred in you a taste for gossip, Mr. Griggs. Not at all, sir, Holmes replied pleasantly. Merely professional admiration. Such ingenuity deserves recognition. Ashcroft's eyes narrowed, studying Holmes with sudden intensity. You have an uncommon interest in such matters for a tradesman. Tell me, Mr. Griggs, who exactly sent you here? Holmes smiled faintly. Why, your conscience, Sir Reginald. The colour drained from the Under-Secretary's face. He rose sharply. This is outrageous. Before he could call out, Holmes stepped forward, his tone now clipped and cold. Spare the indignation, sir. Daniel Pike lies near death, poisoned by your agent. Donlan has confessed enough to damn your entire enterprise. The Wexford parchment you sought to suppress was the final key in a deception spanning generations. You buried a man's honour to preserve your own. Ashcroft's composure cracked. You don't understand. The truth would have undone decades of stability. My ancestors were rewarded for their loyalty after Wexford's disgrace. If that record were exposed, every title, every estate would be tarnished, Holmes finished. A tragedy for your pride, no doubt, but not for justice. Ashcroft's hand slipped toward the drawer of his desk, but Holmes was faster. With one swift movement, he drew back the drawer to reveal not a weapon, but a small bundle of aged papers, tied with red ribbon. The original confession, Holmes said softly. I thought as much. Ashcroft sank into his chair, his strength spent. You cannot imagine the weight of it, he muttered. A single document capable of unmaking generations. My family's honor, my position. Honor, Holmes said, his voice like steel, is not the absence of shame but the courage to face it. You might yet preserve both, Sir Reginald, if you surrender this to the proper authorities. He turned to me. Watson, if you would be so kind as to summon Lestrade from the yard. His men are waiting at the corner. Before I could move, Ashcroft spoke again, his tone weary and hollow. I think this ends here, Holmes, but the machinery you've set in motion will grind more than just my name to dust. There are others, men of power, who will not forgive such meddling. Holmes met his gaze coolly. Then I shall consider it a compliment, sir, that they fear the truth as much as you do. As we departed, I glanced back once to see Ashcroft slumped behind his desk, the pale light from the rain-washed window falling across his motionless hands. Outside, the drizzle had softened into mist. Holmes paused beneath the awning, the recovered parchment tucked safely within his coat. Well, Watson, he said quietly, the circle closes. From a murdered bookbinder to the chambers of Whitehall, the trail has wound through lies as intricate as any stitched binding. Yet, for all its complexity, it remains a simple story, of greed, fear, and the frailty of human pride. I looked at him in admiration. Then we've solved it? He smiled faintly. Solved, perhaps, but not concluded. There remains one matter yet unresolved. Who else profited from the lie, and how far their reach extends? The game, my dear fellow, is far from finished. He stepped into the fog, his silhouette fading like ink dissolving in water, and I followed, feeling that behind the mists of London, darker truths still waited to be unbound. We returned to Baker Street through streets still veiled in mist, the lamps flickering like distant sentinels. Holmes was silent for most of the journey, his face composed but his eyes far away, focused inward, dissecting every layer of deceit that had unfolded before us. When we finally arrived, he removed his coat and threw it across the armchair without a word, pacing the room with that familiar restless energy that told me his mind was far from done. "You saw his face, Watson," he said at last, stopping by the hearth. "The moment I mentioned the hidden compartment, he knew his game was over the instant I uttered the word Wexford. Yet there was something more, something he held back, even in his ruin." I stirred the fire and nodded. "He spoke of others, Holmes, men of power. You think he meant it?" Holmes gave a low hum, the kind he made when testing the strength of a theory. "Most assuredly. Ashcroft is no solitary villain. His kind rarely acts alone. They are instruments, Watson, not composers. Somewhere above him, perhaps even beside him, stands another hand that orchestrated the deceit. And I intend to find it." He crossed to the table where the recovered parchment lay spread open beneath the lamplight. The ink was faded, the edges torn, yet Holmes treated it with the care one might show a living thing. "This document," he murmured, "is the keystone of the entire affair. A confession signed by Lord Wexford himself, yet not in his own hand. Notice the tremor in the strokes, the irregularities. Forced writing, Watson. He was made to sign it under duress." I bent over the parchment. "Then the supposed betrayal of the Crown was a fabrication," Holmes finished, "constructed to elevate the Ashcroft line and destroy Wexford's. History rewritten by convenience and cowardice." He straightened abruptly, his gaze hardening. "But here is the puzzle. Who preserved this forgery all these years? Why not destroy it entirely? Someone wanted it hidden but not lost. Someone powerful enough to guard the truth and cunning enough to profit from its secrecy." A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram upon a small tray. Holmes tore it open and read silently. His brow furrowed, and a glint of grim satisfaction crossed his face. "Lestrade has detained Sir Reginald. The man attempted to flee the city by train. A confession is expected before dawn." "Then it's over," I said, relieved. Holmes's eyes flicked up. "No, my dear fellow. The serpent has shed a skin, that is all." He moved to his violin, drawing the bow gently across the strings, producing a single note that lingered in the air like smoke. "Do you recall the mark upon the ledger we found in Pike's shop? The cipher resembling an intertwined A and C?" I nodded. "You thought it signified an initial." "I did," he said, "but I was mistaken. It stands not for a person but an organization, the Ashcroft Consortium, a clandestine society operating under the guise of political preservation. Their purpose, as I now believe, was to control historical truth itself, reshaping it where convenient and burying it where necessary. Ashcroft was merely their steward." A chill crept through me. "Then the parchment was both a weapon and a liability," Holmes said softly. "Someone within the consortium wanted it retrieved to ensure silence. When Pike stumbled upon its nature during his restoration work, he sealed his own fate." He lowered the violin and turned to me, his tone measured, yet charged with intensity. "We must act swiftly. Ashcroft will not withstand interrogation long, and when he speaks, his masters will know their secrecy is at risk. They will strike again, Watson, this time not in shadows." Before I could answer, a faint rapping came from below. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes, says it's urgent." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Show him up," he called. Moments later, a tall, gaunt figure entered, his coat soaked from the rain, his hat pulled low. He paused at the door, glancing around the room before removing it. I recognized him instantly. "Inspector Lestrade," I exclaimed. "You gave us quite a turn." Lestrade shut the door behind him, his expression grave. "I came as quickly as I could, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald's under guard at the yard, but something's not right." An hour after we took him in, a sealed note arrived, addressed to you. Holmes took the envelope, its red wax unbroken. He examined the seal with a lens, his eyes narrowing. Precisely as I feared. This is the mark again, the intertwined letters. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter. For a moment he read in silence, his face impassive. Then, in a tone colder than I had ever heard from him, he said, "They have taken the initiative, Watson. The consortium warns that should we proceed, the full weight of the government will be turned against us. They threaten to expose evidence of treason, fabricated, of course, linking me to Continental agents." Lestrade's mouth fell open. "Good Lord, Holmes. You can't be serious." Holmes smiled thinly. "I assure you, Inspector, they are." He moved to the window, gazing into the fog-drenched street below. "Do you not see the elegance of it, Watson? When all else fails, truth is not destroyed, it is discredited. They cannot silence me by force, so they will do it by scandal." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "What are your orders, then? Shall I double the guard?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "Guards cannot protect against whispers. I must vanish, at least for a time. They expect resistance, so we shall give them patience instead. Let them believe the threat has worked." He turned back, his eyes alight with purpose. "Watson, there is a place in Sussex, a small estate belonging to an old acquaintance of mine. You will accompany me there tonight. We shall continue from a distance, unseen, unheard, yet very much alive." Lestrade looked between us. "You mean to disappear, Holmes?" "For now," Holmes replied. "History itself is under siege, my good inspector, and its defense requires subtlety. When the truth returns, it must do so with the force of certainty." As Lestrade departed, Holmes began to gather his papers swiftly, his movements precise and deliberate. I watched in silence, feeling the weight of what we were about to undertake. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if these men truly hold such power, can we ever hope to expose them?" He paused, glancing at me with that familiar spark of unyielding resolve. "Hope, Watson, is the one commodity they cannot counterfeit. It is the first thread of every truth worth uncovering." The clock struck midnight as we left Baker Street. The fog lay thick over London, swallowing sound and light alike. Holmes walked ahead, his form blending with the mist. And though I followed closely, a strange thought took hold of me, that even the fog itself seemed to move at his command, drawn forward by the quiet certainty of a man who refused to let the darkness win. The train carried us southward, through the sleeping countryside, its rhythmic motion lulling the senses, even as my mind churned with unanswered questions. Holmes sat opposite me, the faint glow of the carriage lamp illuminating his sharp features. He had drawn the curtain half over the window, obscuring the view as if even the night outside could be watching. His hands were clasped loosely around his knees, and though his expression was calm, I knew the machinery of his thoughts was grinding ceaselessly. "We shall arrive before dawn," he murmured at last. "Lord Harbury's estate lies beyond Eastbourne, quiet, remote, and precisely the sort of place our adversaries would least expect to find us." I regarded him with concern. "Holmes, this consortium you've spoken of, do you truly believe it holds such reach? To threaten your reputation, even manipulate the government's hand?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "My dear Watson, you have seen enough of this world to know that power seldom reveals itself in Parliament or print. The true puppeteers work behind ledgers, seals, and silence. If one can alter what is recorded, one alters what is remembered and thus what is believed." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "The bookbinder's craft, you see, was not chosen by accident. Every volume in his possession, every false binding and sealed page, was a means of preserving or destroying truth. Pike was not merely restoring history, he was guarding it." Before I could reply, the train began to slow, the whistle echoing through the mist. Holmes stood, adjusting his coat. "Come, Watson. The next act unfolds upon quieter boards." We disembarked at a lonely platform barely lit by a single lamp. A carriage awaited, as Holmes had arranged through a coded telegram sent hours before. The driver, a stooped man with a cap pulled low, said nothing, merely touched the brim of his hat and led the horse down the dirt road. The journey to Harbury Manor took us through twisting lanes, lined with hedgerows that seemed to close in like dark walls. When we arrived, dawn was a pale glimmer behind the trees. The manor loomed large and solemn, its ivy-choked facade giving it the air of a place forgotten by time. Lord Harbury himself greeted us at the door, a tall, silver-haired gentleman whose expression carried both intellect and discretion, qualities Holmes clearly valued. "My dear Holmes," he said quietly, ushering us in, "your message was brief, but I gathered enough to understand the necessity of secrecy. You will find this house well guarded, and its servants sworn to silence." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Then we shall impose upon your hospitality for a few days. There is a storm gathering in London, and we must remain unseen until it breaks." We were shown to adjoining chambers overlooking the misty garden. Holmes wasted no time, spreading his notes across the writing desk, arranging them with the precision of a military strategist. I watched as he pinned the parchment from Pike's shop to the center, surrounding it with fragments of letters, sketches, and symbols. "This, Watson," he said, tapping the parchment, "is the nucleus. The forgery of Wexford's confession is the oldest known link to the consortium's work. But here," he pointed to another note, "is the pattern that betrays them. Each document altered by their hand bears the same emblem, hidden in decorative motifs or flourishes of ink. It is a mark of ownership and, I believe, of pride. These men have operated under anonymity so long that they leave their signature where none would think to look." I leaned closer, recognizing the faintly drawn emblem, a pair of entwined letters. "The same as the seal on the letter," I murmured. "Precisely," said Holmes. "Their arrogance will be their undoing. I have written to Mycroft through secure channels, requesting records from the Treasury archives. If I am correct, certain influential men whose fortunes rose swiftly after Wexford's disgrace were, in fact, silent partners in the consortium." A soft knock came at the door. Harbury entered, his brow furrowed. "Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but a messenger arrived just now. He claims it is urgent and bears your signature." Holmes accepted the folded note and examined it briefly. "Fair forgery," he said at once, tossing it into the fire. "They have found us." I felt a chill sweep through me. "Already? We only arrived hours ago." Holmes paced the room. "They anticipated flight, not surrender. They would rather destroy evidence than let us speak. Watson, have your revolver ready. I fear tonight's quiet will not last." Harbury stiffened. "You are safe here, Holmes. My grounds are well guarded." Holmes stopped, his gaze fixed out the window. "Against thieves, perhaps, not against the truth's assassins." Evening fell heavy upon the estate, the rain beginning in soft, persistent threads. Holmes remained by the desk, scribbling furiously, pausing only to listen to distant sounds, the creak of floorboards, the moan of wind. Around midnight, he extinguished the lamp. "Come," he whispered, "to the library." We moved silently through the darkened halls. In the vast library, moonlight poured faintly through tall windows, gleaming upon the bindings of hundreds of volumes. Holmes went directly to a shelf near the back, pulling free a book bound in dull brown leather. He turned it over, pressed the spine, and a small click sounded. A panel slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. "By heaven, Holmes!" I gasped. Inside lay a slim ledger bound in blue vellum. Holmes opened it carefully, scanning its contents. "This is it," he breathed. "The consortium's accounts, names, dates, payments. Harbury, your house was chosen well indeed. Someone concealed their treasure under your roof, trusting secrecy above loyalty." A sudden crash echoed through the hall. Footsteps, swift, heavy, and unmistakably hostile, approached from the direction of the main door. "They are here," Holmes said quietly. "Watson, into the study alcove. Keep your weapons steady." The door burst open. 3 men entered, their coats dripping rain, their movements silent but purposeful. The tallest among them carried a pistol, another bore a satchel. Holmes remained perfectly still, the ledger in his hand. "You've come for this, I presume?" he said coldly. "An unwise journey, gentlemen." The leader stepped forward, his voice low. "You meddle in matters far beyond you, Mr. Holmes. That book does not belong to you." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Then perhaps you will explain why it bears your crest within its cover." The man hesitated, and in that instant, Holmes moved. With a sudden motion, he flung the ledger toward the fire. The men shouted. One lunged to retrieve it, another raised his weapon. A single gunshot cracked through the room, the echo deafening. When the smoke cleared, the leader lay disarmed, his wrist bleeding from a glancing wound. Watson's bullet had found its mark. The other 2 were subdued by Harbury's servants, who had rushed in at the commotion. Holmes retrieved the ledger from the hearth, its pages singed but intact. "You see, gentlemen," he said with quiet triumph, "truth, once kindled, is not so easily extinguished." By morning the intruders were in custody, and Holmes had already arranged their delivery to Lestrade. He watched the carriage depart from the manor steps, his expression unreadable. "They will talk," I said. "Oh, undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "Men such as these value life too dearly to die for principle." He turned to me, his gaze softening. "And so ends the bookbinder's secret, Watson. Not with vengeance, but with revelation. History will write itself, as it always must, when falsehood can no longer bear its own weight." The sun broke through the clouds then, gilding the wet fields in pale gold. Holmes took a slow breath as though drawing strength from the morning. "Come," he said, motioning toward the carriage. "We have done our part. Let posterity decide the rest." And as we departed Harbury Manor, I could not help but feel that the fog which had cloaked London's streets for so long had at last begun to lift. The carriage rattled steadily along the country lane, its wheels splashing through shallow puddles left by the morning rain. Holmes sat beside me, his head turned toward the passing fields, though I suspected his mind was miles away, perhaps still within the shadowed corridors of Harbury Manor, tracing the hidden roots of deceit we had so narrowly unravelled. The air outside was sharp and clean after the storm, yet an undercurrent of unease persisted between us, the sense that something vital had been resolved, and yet not entirely ended. "You appear thoughtful, Holmes," I said at last, breaking the silence. "Surely after the night we've had, even your mind deserves a moment's peace." He smiled faintly, though without mirth. "Peace, my dear Watson, is but the interlude, between the questions one has answered and the questions that remain. You must have noticed it yourself. The ledger we recovered was incomplete," I started. "Incomplete, but it contained names, accounts, signatures, evidence enough to condemn the entire consortium." "Indeed, enough to bring their foot soldiers to ruin," Holmes replied, "but not their masters. Notice what was missing. No mention of Ashcroft's higher patrons, no trace of the men who benefited most from Wexford's disgrace. That omission, Watson, was deliberate. Someone ensured their names were absent long before the ledger found its resting place within the walls of Harbury Manor." His tone was calm, yet beneath it I sensed a grim determination. Holmes was not one to leave a thread unpulled, no matter how tangled. "So you believe," I ventured, "that the true architect of the scheme remains unknown?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "Precisely so, and more to the point, alive. The men who came for the ledger last night were expendable. Their orders were to retrieve or destroy, not to understand. Puppets rarely see the hands that guide them." As he spoke, the carriage turned onto a broader road where the distant spires of London began to pierce the misty horizon. Holmes drew his collar higher, his gaze sharpening. "Our disappearance will have confused them, but confusion is a temporary luxury. The consortium will soon learn that the ledger survived, and with it, their exposure becomes inevitable. That is when they will grow desperate." We arrived at Baker Street shortly before noon. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual good nature, though her relief was evident. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the papers are full of dreadful talk and attempted robbery, men in disguise, the police all over Eastbourne. I do hope you've not been mixed up in it." Holmes offered a reassuring smile. "My dear Mrs. Hudson, rest assured, if we were, I trust it ended rather better for us than for them." He removed his coat and handed it to her, then strode directly to his desk, where the Morning Post lay waiting in a neat stack. He sifted through the letters swiftly, pausing only when one caught his attention. The envelope bore no address beyond Baker Street, London, yet the handwriting was elegant, practiced, and vaguely familiar. Holmes slit it open, and as his eyes moved across the page, I saw a flicker of interest replace his earlier fatigue. "It seems," he said, "that our adversaries are quicker than anticipated." The letter contained a single line: "You have opened a door that was never meant to be seen. Step through it, and you will find it closes behind you forever." There was no signature, only the same faint watermark we had seen on the forged confession, a coiled serpent biting its own tail. "A warning, then," I muttered. "More than that," Holmes replied softly. "It is an invitation." He stood abruptly and began pacing the room, his steps measured and deliberate. This mark, Watson, it is not merely symbolic. The serpent devouring itself, the Ouroboros, signifies eternity through destruction, life feeding upon its own end. It is the consortium's emblem of philosophy, truth consumed to preserve falsehood. And this letter, this is their way of drawing me nearer, of observing my next move. I frowned. Then you mean to respond? Not in kind, he said, but by listening. When one cannot see the hand that strikes, it is sometimes wiser to let the blow fall, so that the shadow betrays its source. For the next several hours, Holmes worked in silence. He reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced names from the ledger, and filled pages with deductions so dense that even my medical training could not keep pace. The fog outside thickened, again pressing against the window panes, and as dusk settled, he finally pushed back from the desk. "It is time," he said. "Time for what?" "For us to pay a visit to the archives beneath Westminster." "The government archives?" I exclaimed. "Holmes, after what has transpired, surely we cannot simply walk in." He allowed himself a quiet laugh. "Not as ourselves, perhaps. But London is forgiving to the unseen. There are records there, archival signatures and revisions that bear the same watermark as this serpent's mark. If we can locate them, we shall know who authorized the alterations that buried Wexford's name." Within the hour, we were in a hansom cab bound for Westminster. Holmes had donned a disguise so ordinary it was almost invisible, his features dulled by false spectacles and the dust of a tradesman's coat. I followed in his wake, feeling the familiar thrill of danger, coupled with the steady reassurance that no man was safer in peril than when guided by Sherlock Holmes. The night watchman at the archive building was easily persuaded by a forged letter of introduction and a sovereign placed discreetly in his palm. We descended into the dim vaults, where the government's most guarded documents lay encased in heavy drawers of oak and iron. The air was cold and dry, carrying the faint smell of parchment and secrecy. Holmes moved with purpose, tracing his finger along the numbered drawers until he stopped at one labeled Historical Correspondence, 1875, 1885. He extracted a folder marked with the Wexford seal and laid it open on the table. "There," he whispered. "The same paper, the same watermark, but the hand, Watson. Observe it carefully. The ink here betrays a difference in composition. This signature was added years later, under artificial light. The man who signed this did so not in truth but in preservation of a lie." I leaned closer. "Can you identify the hand?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, the pressure is distinctive. The flourish at the end of the C unmistakable. It belongs to Sir Reginald Ashcroft's superior at the ministry, Lord Vernon, the true author of the forgery." At that moment, the faint creak of a door reached us. Holmes extinguished the lamp with a swift motion, plunging us into darkness. Footsteps echoed through the corridor, deliberate and slow. A faint beam of light wavered across the shelves, moving closer. Holmes gripped my arm and whispered, "Stay still." The figure paused near the doorway, scanning the rows of documents. For a moment, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, as if satisfied, the intruder withdrew, the door closing softly behind him. Holmes waited another minute before relighting the lamp. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "truth has guardians even in the dark, but so do lies. We have stirred the serpent in its nest." We replaced the files and made our exit without further encounter. As we stepped into the cold air of Westminster Bridge, the fog curling around the gaslights, Holmes turned to me with an expression I had seen only a few times before, a mixture of triumph and foreboding. "Tonight we have learned who forged the past," he said. "Tomorrow we shall learn why." And as the bells of Big Ben tolled midnight above us, I could not help but feel that London itself was holding its breath, waiting for what Holmes would uncover next. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, the mist still clinging to the rooftops of London like a veil reluctant to lift. I awoke to the sound of Holmes already in motion, his footsteps quick, deliberate, and echoing faintly through the sitting room. When I entered, he was bent over the table. The remnants of our late-night discovery spread before him, the forged document, the ominous letter, and a handful of freshly printed broadsheets reporting the supposed theft of sensitive government records. He did not look up as I entered. "Our nocturnal visitor was not there by chance, Watson," he said quietly. The moment we withdrew the Wexford file, someone within the ministry knew of it. That can only mean one thing. Our actions are being watched from within. I frowned, taking a seat opposite him. You believe there's a mole in the ministry itself? Holmes finally raised his eyes, their grey clarity sharpened by thought. More than one, I should think. Lord Vernon may have orchestrated the forgery, but men of his standing rarely act without counsel. His purpose must have served a greater cause. The question is, what was worth silencing Wexford's name for nearly 20 years? Before I could reply, there came a firm knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, looking rather uneasy. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." He wouldn't give his name. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of calculation pass across his face. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," he said simply. A tall man entered, his overcoat still wet from the morning fog. His features were sharp but not unkind, his manner restrained, though his eyes betrayed a kind of fevered worry. He removed his hat and bowed slightly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Forgive this intrusion, but I had no other course left." Holmes gestured toward the chair by the fire. "Then by all means, sir, unburden yourself. Your voice carries the weight of decision, not impulse." The man hesitated, as if deciding how much truth to reveal. "My name is Inspector Henry Rathbone. I am attached to the Home Office, though unofficially I represent a special division that monitors irregularities in government contracts and foreign correspondence. 2 nights ago, a coded message passed through our network, origin unknown but addressed directly to Lord Vernon's private office. The content referred to a breach of containment and the exposure of prior correspondence." Holmes leaned forward, his interest quickened. "The language suggests a controlled network of information, one that expected to remain undiscovered. You believe this message concerns the Wexford affair?" Rathbone nodded. "We have reason to think so. But more troubling still, the cipher used in that message was an old naval code, one retired decades ago. Only a few men still living would know it." Holmes rose abruptly, pacing to the window. "And Wexford," he murmured, "served as a naval consultant before his disgrace." He turned back, eyes alight with sudden understanding. "Watson, don't you see? His supposed scandal wasn't born from greed. It was silenced intelligence. He uncovered something within the Admiralty, something they buried by branding him a traitor." The inspector's expression darkened. "If you're right, Holmes, then the matter is far more dangerous than I feared. There are whispers already. Foreign interests purchasing naval blueprints, a network of smugglers operating out of the Channel ports. If the consortium you mentioned still lives, they could be the very brokers of that information." Holmes's hand rested on the mantel, his gaze distant but razor-sharp. "And Vernon, their political shield. Yes, it aligns perfectly. The forgery, the ledger, the serpent's mark. It all speaks of one enterprise, the trade of secrets beneath the guise of governance." He turned suddenly, his voice brisk with decision. "Inspector, I shall require access to the Home Office archives under your protection. There is a letter, one sent from Wexford to the Admiralty on the eve of his disgrace. It was never released to the public inquiry, yet its existence was hinted at during the proceedings. If we can find it, we may learn what he knew and who feared it." Rathbone hesitated. "That letter was sealed by direct order of Lord Vernon himself." "Precisely why it must be opened," Holmes replied, a gleam in his eye. "For once the truth is unsealed, the serpent will have no skin left to hide beneath." By late afternoon, the three of us found ourselves again in the shadowed corridors of Westminster, this time under official escort. Rathbone's credentials gained us entry, where stealth had once been our weapon. Yet even with authority on our side, the atmosphere within the records room was no less oppressive. Dust clung to the air, and each footstep seemed to echo longer than it should. Holmes located the sealed case within minutes, an envelope bearing Wexford's name, secured beneath a wax stamp of the ministry's crest. He examined it closely before breaking the seal with a small knife. The paper within was yellowed with age, but the ink, though faded, remained legible. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "He warned them," Holmes said. "Wexford warned them that the ministry's own procurement chain had been infiltrated, that false contracts were being drawn up for the sale of naval technology to a foreign power." He named his suspect, Lord Vernon himself, and for that he was branded a traitor. Rathbone's face went pale. My God, that means— It means, Holmes interrupted, that Vernham's rise, his power, and the entire network beneath him are built upon betrayal and the convenient burial of a man's honor. But the consortium did not merely profit from the scandal, they ensured Wexford's silence became their currency. He folded the letter carefully, his gaze steady. Now that we possess proof, Vernham will move swiftly. His influence extends into the courts, the press, even the Yard. He cannot afford for this to surface. Then what do we do? I asked. Holmes's lips curved into that familiar, dangerous smile. We do, my dear Watson, what serpents fear most. We expose them to daylight. But as he spoke, the door at the far end of the corridor opened with a slow, deliberate creak. A shadow stepped through, broad-shouldered, gloved, and silent. Then another and another, until 3 men blocked our exit. Their faces were expressionless, but the faint glint beneath their coats told me all I needed to know. Holmes did not flinch. He turned to me, his tone perfectly calm. Watson, I believe our friend Lord Vernham has decided to accelerate events. Kindly keep your revolver within reach. I fear we are about to learn just how far his serpent's tail coils. The air grew thick, charged with the tension of unspoken violence. Rathbone's hand went instinctively to his coat, but Holmes raised his palm slightly, stopping him. No sudden moves, he murmured. Our adversaries prefer silence before chaos. They will speak before they strike. Let us hear what Vernham has to say for itself. The tallest of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and deliberate. Mr. Holmes, he said, the serpent does not fear daylight. It thrives in it, because men like you create the shadows. Holmes's eyes narrowed, every trace of weariness gone. Then let us see, he said softly, whose light burns longer. And in that breathless pause that followed, I understood with certainty that the game had entered its final act, and that one misstep, one flicker of doubt could cost us far more than truth.